Hi, my name is Liz City. I'm excited to talk with you today about two of my favorite topics, the core and task. And I'm going to try to persuade you that these are incredibly powerful places to focus when you're trying to improve learning and teaching. So, what I'm going to do in this session is I'm going to try to help us build some shared understanding of what do I mean by the core and what is task and how could it be a powerful place to focus for improving learning. Now, whenever I'm working with educators, I hope that we try to leave our time together with a new idea or question, something that has you thinking a little differently. And usually, I also hope that you leave acting a little differently. But given the asynchronous webinar environment, I'm going to let us off the hook for acting differently with a tool or a practice that you would use. Although I am going to give you a couple that you can try. At the very least, I want you to leave thinking and hopefully even seeing your work a little bit differently. So the way we're going to do that is first I'm going to try to describe what I mean by the core. And then I'm going to talk about tasks and how you can really analyze a task. Then we'll talk a little bit about chocolate cake, and I'll finish up with some tips for meetings. So all of these things are designed to help you in a busy, distracting environment that is schools, whether during a pandemic or not. How do you try to focus on the most important things? Well, the first idea is to think about what's at the core of our work. This word core is really important because it says, here's the heart of our work. Those of you who know Latin or one of the Romance languages, you might know that the word core comes from the Latin word for heart. So if you know French, le coeur, Spanish, el corazón, it's saying the core is the heart of our work. Now, some colleagues of mine and I wrote a piece about the instructional core, and it's in your resources, and I highly recommend you read it. Many educators have told me over the years that it's one of their favorite texts. So I'm offering it to you, hope it's useful to you, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you everything that's in the article, because that's what the article is for. But I do want to offer a couple of things related to that piece. So this notion of the core, and in the chapter we call it the instructional core, think of it as a triangle. And in the triangle, we've got teachers, students, and content. And the idea is all the core is teachers and students interacting with content. That's the heart of our work. So if we can focus on that, even when other things are trying to distract us, that focus alone will help us be more effective in our work. So that's the idea of the instructional core. And in the chapter, we describe 7 principles of the instructional core. And they're also in the slides that go with this little talk. So you can see we have lots of different kind of core principles of the instructional core. So you see, principle 1 says increases in student learning occur only as a consequence of improvements in the level of content, teachers' knowledge and skill, and student engagement. The basic idea there is we're not getting any better at learning unless we do some combination of increasing teachers' knowledge and skill, what students are doing, and what's the level of the content. So principle 2 is connected to that, and it's really important. It says, well, if you change one of those, you actually have to change the other two. So if we're going to raise the level of the content, if we don't also raise teachers' knowledge and skill, and we don't also raise students' engagement and feeling of efficacy related to that higher level of content, we're not going to get very far. Kind of how it plays out is whatever the lowest common denominator there is where we're going to land, even if we raise one part of the core. And often we lose sight of that when we're working on the core. Principle 3, if you can't see it in the core, it's not there. What that's saying is no matter how much you talk about it in your work, and you might have fancy strategies and colorful documents that say here all their plan, 20-page plan, all those things. What it's saying is if you can't see it when you go into a classroom, it's not happening, no matter how much it's part of your plans, all right? Principle 4 and principle 5, we're going to come back to when we talk about task. Principle 6 says we learn to do the work by doing the work. All that's saying is, like, stop talking about it so much. Just go try it. And the way we get better is by practicing. All this learning and teaching and leadership stuff, it's a practice. We get better by practicing it. Principle 7 says description before analysis, analysis before prediction, prediction before evaluation. And what that's saying is all of us tend, this is just because of the way our brains work, tend to leap to judgment. And what it's saying is slow that brain down very deliberately and try to look at what is actually happening. So if you're looking at a piece of student work or you're in a classroom, your brain is automatically telling you what you like, what you don't like. You got to just slow that down, because what you like and what you don't like, it's useful for you, but it's not a very productive way to have a conversation. So if you're going to have a conversation, let's start with the evidence of what we see in front of us. Then let's see what kind of patterns we have across the evidence we have. Then let's predict what would be happening as a result of what we're seeing. And then we can provide some form of saying, does this look like what we want? Yes or no? And then that informs our action. So that's the idea, is basically just to slow ourselves down and not be so judgmental about what we're seeing or not seeing. Now, with all of that, that was just my quick rundown of the instructional core. And you'll see in the slide deck that I provided you a protocol called Save the Last Word, which is my absolute favorite way to engage with that text with a group of educators. And you'll see the protocol right in there. And I find, rather than what I just did, which I only did because we're in a webinar, rather than that, what I usually do is just invite people to read that text ahead of our getting together, invite them to pick 2 quotes that strike them, and then have people get into groups of 4, maximum 5, and they share their quote. And you can see how the protocol works as described on the slide. What's powerful about using that protocol with this text is that it lets people make meaning for themselves. So instead of me preaching at you about all of what the principles of the core are, people just pick whatever is most resonant for them about that text. They pick a second quote just as a backup in case somebody else picks their favorite quote. And it's a great way, this Save the Last Word protocol, of surfacing the key ideas in the text. And then I usually just open it up and see if anybody has things they want to share from their conversation, or if they have questions that they want to discuss. But other than that, that's the conversation. We don't lecture about the instructional core usually. So just share that as one tool you could use in your practice. Now, once you've engaged with that text, you might notice that we wrote it a little while ago. I think it came out maybe in 2009, and it's still very relevant. But as with all things, I keep learning, and so my thinking evolves. So if I were going to write that chapter again, I would adjust a couple of things. So one thing I would do is I would change some of the language of teacher-student content. I would change the language to say, instead of student, why don't we use the word learner? Because now we've got the word learning in there. And instead of teacher, why don't we use the word facilitator? And I would leave content the same. There are a couple reasons I would do this. One is that I think learner facilitator content more accurately reflects what we're trying to go for with 21st century learning. So when I hear teacher student, kind of conjures old school model of teacher up in front of the classroom talking to students. Okay, well, that's not what I'm hoping learning looks like all the time. And so maybe if we have learner and facilitator, we're thinking about teacher as a facilitator of learning. So that's one reason I would change it. The other reason I would change it is that if you say learner facilitator content and you think of the triangle that way, you can think about that at all layers of a system. You can think about it in a school, you can think about it in a system of schools, and sometimes the students, in fact, are the facilitators of learning. Sometimes a teacher is a facilitator, sometimes a teacher is a learner. Sometimes a principal is a facilitator, sometimes a principal is a learner. You get the idea. So if we use this notion of learners and facilitators in content, we can think about our core work throughout a school and throughout a system. So that's why I would change it that way. The other thing I would change is I would just change the name of it. I had long debates with my colleague Richard Elmore, from whom I originally learned this idea, and he always called it the instructional core, but I like to think of it as the learning core. And I always thought of instruction again with that kind of old school model. When I hear the word instruction, I think teaching. When I hear the word learning, I'm more focused on what's happening in the minds and hearts of the people who are engaged with it. So I would call it the learning core. You call it whatever you want. The notion is core, and that's the focal point of our work.